They said she was nothing but a runaway Apache girl, broken beyond repair. But when Matthew Sandival found her trembling in his barn that storm-lashed night, he saw something else entirely, a warrior's spirit crushed but not destroyed. What happened next would challenge everything the frontier believed about love, honor, and the courage it takes to heal a shattered soul. Stay with me until the end of this incredible true story, and don't forget to comment below with your city, so I can see how far this tale of redemption has traveled across our beautiful country. The storm hit Sandival Ranch like the wrath of God himself, driving sheets of rain across the Texas plains with a fury that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Lightning split the darkness in jagged white scars, illuminating the sprawling ranch house and weathered outbuildings for brief, violent moments before plunging everything back into an abyss of howling wind and thunder. Matthew Sandival pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders as he fought his way through the tempest toward the barn. At 34, he was a man carved by loss and hardened by the unforgiving frontier, broad-shouldered from years of ranch work, his face weathered like old leather eyes, the color of storm clouds that seemed to hold their own perpetual sorrow. 3 years had passed since Sarah's death. 3 years since consumption had stolen away the only woman he'd ever loved, leaving him alone in a house that echoed with memories and a heart that had forgotten how to hope. The wind caught the barn door as he struggled to open it, slamming it back against the wall with a crash that made his horses whinny in alarm. Lightning flashed again, and in that split second of brilliant illumination, Matthew saw something that made his blood freeze in his veins. Huddled in the far corner of the barn, pressed back against the hay bales, like a wounded animal seeking shelter, was a figure so small and still he might have missed it entirely if not for that perfectly timed bolt of lightning. It was a young woman, or perhaps barely more than a girl, with long black hair plastered wet against her skull, wearing what remained of a torn and mud-stained dress that might once have been white. But it was her eyes that struck him most powerfully, dark as midnight, and filled with such raw primal terror that Matthew instinctively took a step back. She was Apache. Even in the dim light filtering through the barn's gaps, there was no mistaking the delicate bone structure, the bronze skin, the way she held herself coiled like a spring, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. And she was hurt. Matthew could see that much even from across the barn. Her left arm hung at an odd angle, and dark stains on her dress suggested injuries beyond what the storm could account for. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The girl, for she couldn't have been more than 17 or 18, stared at him with the wide-eyed terror of a deer caught in a hunter's sights. Matthew had seen that look before in the eyes of horses that had been broken too hard, too fast. It was the look of something that had learned that survival meant never trusting, never hoping, never letting down your guard even for a moment. "Easy there," Matthew said softly, his voice barely audible above the storm. He raised his hands slowly, palms out, the universal gesture of peace that transcended language barriers. "I'm not going to hurt you." The girl's response was immediate and heartbreaking. She pressed herself even further back against the hay bales, as if she could somehow disappear into them entirely. Her lips moved silently, and Matthew caught what sounded like whispered prayers, or perhaps a chant in her native tongue. Tears mixed with rainwater on her cheeks, and her whole body shook, whether from cold fear or pain, he couldn't tell. Probably all three. Matthew's mind raced as he tried to process what he was seeing. Apache raids had been a constant threat throughout his childhood, though they'd grown less common in recent years, as the army had driven most of the tribes onto reservations. But this girl wasn't a raider. She was clearly running from something, seeking shelter just as desperately as any creature caught in the storm's fury. The wind howled through the barn's gaps, causing the girl to flinch violently at every sound. Matthew noticed how her eyes never stopped moving, constantly scanning for escape routes or hidden threats. She was like a wild thing trapped in a cage, and he knew that one wrong move, one sudden gesture would send her fleeing back into the deadly storm. "My name is Matthew," he said, keeping his voice low and steady. "Matthew Sandival. This is my ranch, my barn. You're safe here." The girl's eyes flicked to his face for just an instant before darting away again, as if even that brief moment of eye contact was more than she could bear. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse and broken. "Please, no." The words were in English, heavily accented, but clear enough. Matthew felt his heart clench at the desperation in that simple plea. Whatever had happened to this girl, whatever had driven her to seek shelter in his barn during one of the worst storms he'd seen in years, it had left her shattered in ways that went far deeper than physical injuries. Lightning flashed again, followed immediately by a crack of thunder so loud it seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. The girl whimpered and covered her head with her arms, her whole body convulsing with terror. In that moment, Matthew made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Moving with deliberate slowness, he reached for an old horse blanket hanging on a nearby peg. The girl tensed as he moved, but he kept talking in that same gentle, steady voice. "Just getting you something warm," he murmured. "You're soaked through, and this storm's not letting up anytime soon." He held the blanket out toward her, not approaching, but offering it from a safe distance. For a long moment she stared at it, as if it might be some kind of trap. Then, with movements so careful they seemed almost painful, she reached out and took it immediately, wrapping it around her shoulders like armor. "That's good," Matthew said, settling himself down on a hay bale several feet away, close enough to talk, far enough to not seem threatening. "What's your name?" The question seemed to confuse her. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, shaking her head slightly. Matthew wondered if she'd forgotten her own name, or if she'd learned not to give it too freely. "You don't have to tell me," he said quickly. "Not until you're ready." Ready. The word seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy with implications neither of them fully understood yet. But something about it seemed to resonate with the girl. Her shaking lessened slightly, and for just a moment, the wild terror in her eyes gave way to something that might have been curiosity. "Are you hurt?" Matthew asked, nodding toward her injured arm. "I've got some medical supplies in the house. Nothing fancy, but I've patched up enough cowboys and horses to know the basics." The mention of leaving the barn sent the girl into another spiral of panic. She clutched the blanket tighter and shook her head frantically. No, can't. They'll find—" "Who'll find you?" Matthew asked gently. But the question only seemed to increase her distress. She began rocking back and forth, muttering words in Apache that he couldn't understand, but whose meaning was clear enough in their desperate cadence. Matthew's jaw tightened as pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. Apache women and children had been disappearing from the reservations for months now, taken by slavers and sold to brothels or wealthy landowners who preferred their servants to have no legal protections. The authorities turned a blind eye, claiming the missing were simply returning to the wild or had been killed in skirmishes that conveniently had no witnesses. But here was living proof that at least some of those missing had not vanished willingly. This girl had clearly escaped from somewhere, fled through the storm-lashed night to find refuge in his barn. The torn dress, the injuries, the absolute terror at the thought of being found, it painted a picture that made Matthew's blood boil with rage. "Listen to me," he said, his voice taking on a firm but gentle authority. "I don't know what happened to you or who you're running from, but I can promise you this: no one is going to hurt you while you're under my roof. Do you understand?" The girl lifted her eyes to his face for the second time, and Matthew felt something shift in his chest. Despite the fear, despite the trauma that had clearly shattered her spirit, there was something unbroken in those dark depths. A spark of defiance, perhaps, or simply the stubborn will to survive that had carried her this far. "You promise," she whispered. "I promise," Matthew said solemnly, "and I keep my word. Always." She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to read the truth written there. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because she nodded slightly and pulled the blanket tighter around herself. The storm continued to rage outside, but within the barn, a strange kind of peace had settled. Matthew remained where he was, not pushing for more conversation, not demanding explanations or gratitude. He simply sat and watched over this broken bird that had sought shelter in his domain, offering the one thing she needed most: patience. As the night wore on, he began to notice small things about her. The way she favored her right side suggested ribs that were bruised or cracked. The careful way she held her head indicated possible injuries there as well. But it was the psychological damage that concerned him most. The way she flinched at every sound, the constant vigilance even in apparent safety, the deep-seated terror that seemed to have burrowed into her very soul. Dawn was still hours away when Matthew made his second life-changing decision of the night. Standing slowly to avoid startling her, he began moving around the barn, checking on his horses and settling them for the remainder of the storm. The familiar routine seemed to calm the girl as well. There was something soothing about watching him work. With quiet competence, his movements, economical and sure. "I'm going to stay out here tonight," he announced softly. "Make sure the storm doesn't damage anything. You can rest if you want. I'll keep watch." The relief in her eyes was unmistakable. For the first time since he'd found her, some of the rigid tension left her shoulders. She curled up in the corner with the horse blanket wrapped around her like a cocoon, but Matthew noticed she didn't actually close her eyes. Even exhausted, even in what passed for safety, she couldn't let herself be that vulnerable. As he settled in for what would be a long, uncomfortable night on a pile of hay, Matthew found his thoughts turning to Sarah. His late wife had possessed an infinite capacity for gentleness, a gift for healing wounded things that had extended far beyond her official role as the town's unofficial veterinarian. She had nursed injured birds back to health, tamed wild horses, with nothing but patience and kindness, and had somehow managed to love even Matthew's rough edges into something resembling civilization. "What would you do, Sarah?" he whispered into the darkness. But even as he asked the question, he already knew the answer. Sarah would have done exactly what he was doing, offered shelter without conditions, protection without payment, and the kind of patient compassion that asked nothing in return. The storm began to weaken as the night progressed, the thunder growing more distant, and the rain settling into a steady patter against the barn's roof. In the relative quiet, Matthew became aware of soft sounds coming from the girl's corner, not crying exactly, but something between a sob and a sigh, repeated at regular intervals like a broken heartbeat. "Bad dreams?" he asked softly. She started at his voice, having perhaps thought he was asleep. In the dim light, he could see her nodding slightly. "I get those too," Matthew admitted. "Lost my wife 3 years ago. Took a long time before I could sleep through the night without seeing her in my dreams, reaching out for help I couldn't give." Something in his tone seemed to reach her. She shifted slightly, and when she spoke, her voice was still barely a whisper, but carried a note of curiosity. "She died. Consumption," Matthew said simply. "Took her slow. Had time to say goodbye at least, but that almost made it worse. Watching someone you love fade away bit by bit, and knowing there's nothing you can do to stop it." The girl was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a voice so soft he almost missed it, she said, "My family. They killed my family." Matthew felt his hands clench into fists, but he kept his voice level. "I'm sorry. That's a pain I can't imagine. Burned our camp, shot the men, took the women and children." Her words came in short, broken phrases, as if speaking them caused physical pain. "Sold us, like horses, like things." "But you got away," Matthew observed. "Ran, in the storm. They will look, they will find." The terror was creeping back into her voice, and Matthew could see her beginning to retreat into herself again. "No," he said firmly. "They won't find you, not here. This is my land, and I protect what's mine." She looked at him sharply, and Matthew realized how his words might have sounded. He raised his hands again in that gesture of peace. I don't mean you belong to me, he clarified quickly. I mean you're under my protection. There's a difference. Is there? The question was barely audible, but it carried the weight of experience that had taught her otherwise. Yes, Matthew said, with quiet conviction, there is, and I'll prove it to you, however long it takes. The first pale light of dawn was beginning to filter through the barn's gaps when the girl finally spoke her name. Citlali, she whispered. My name is Citlali. Matthew tested the unfamiliar syllables, trying to pronounce them correctly. Citlali, that's a beautiful name. What does it mean? Star, she said, and for just a moment something that might have been the ghost of a smile flickered across her face. My mother said I was born under shooting stars. Well then, Citlali, Matthew said, rising from his makeshift bed of hay and moving to look out at the lightening sky. Looks like the storm's passed. Are you hungry? The question seemed to surprise her, as if the basic need for food was something she'd learned to ignore. But after a moment she nodded hesitantly. I'll bring you something from the house, Matthew said, and some clean clothes if you'll accept them. Won't be much, probably one of my old shirts and some trousers, but they'll be dry and warm. Citlali looked down at her torn, mud-stained dress and nodded again, more firmly this time. I'll be back in a few minutes, Matthew promised. Will you be all right alone? She considered the question seriously before answering. Yes, I think, yes. As Matthew walked from the barn toward his house, he found himself moving with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. There was work to be done, healing that needed to happen, and a promise to keep. He had told this broken girl that he would protect her, that he would wait until she was ready to trust. It was a vow that would test every ounce of patience he possessed and challenge everything he thought he knew about love, redemption, and the courage required to heal another's wounds. But as he looked back at the barn where Citlali waited wrapped in a horse blanket and holding on to the first fragile threads of hope she'd known. In months, Matthew Sandival knew he had never made a promise he was more determined to keep. The morning sun broke free of the clouds as he reached his front porch, painting the storm-washed landscape in shades of gold and amber. It was the beginning of a new day, and perhaps, if he was very careful and very patient, the beginning of something else entirely, a second chance at life for a lonely rancher and a broken Apache girl who had somehow found each other in the midst of the storm. Matthew's boots echoed against the wooden porch as he gathered what Citlali would need, his mind already working through the delicate balance of care and distance this situation would require. Inside his modest ranch house, everything remained exactly as Sarah had left it. Her sewing basket still sat beside her favorite chair, her books lined the shelves in careful order, her presence lingering in every corner like a gentle ghost. He moved through the familiar spaces with quiet efficiency, pulling together clean clothes, basic medical supplies, and enough food for several meals. When he returned to the barn, he found Citlali exactly where he'd left her, but something had changed. She was sitting straighter now, her dark eyes tracking his movement with less of that wild terror and more of what might have been cautious curiosity. The horse blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, but she no longer looked quite so much like a cornered animal. I brought some things, Matthew said, setting a basket down well within her reach, but not so close as to seem threatening. There's bread, some cold beef, and Sarah's old riding clothes. They might be a bit large, but they're clean and warm. Citlali's gaze fixed on the basket, and Matthew saw her throat work as she swallowed hard. Sarah, my wife, Matthew explained gently. She passed 3 years ago. She was about your size, maybe a little taller. I think her clothes would fit you better than mine. She stared at the offered garments for a long moment, as if trying to understand the concept of kindness without expectation. You give me dead woman's clothes. The way she phrased it might have sounded harsh to some, but Matthew heard the genuine confusion underneath. In her world, gifts came with prices, and kindness was a luxury that people like her were rarely offered. Sarah would have wanted someone to use them, Matthew said simply. She never could stand to see anything go to waste, especially if it might help someone in need. Citlali reached out slowly, her fingers brushing against the soft fabric of a simple blue dress. For a moment, her expression softened with something that might have been wonder, as if she'd forgotten what it felt like to touch something clean and beautiful. "I'll step outside while you change," Matthew offered, turning toward the barn door. "Take your time. No one's going anywhere." "Wait." The word came out sharper than she'd intended, and Citlali immediately looked stricken. "I mean, please, don't go far." Matthew paused, understanding flooding through him. She was terrified of being alone, but equally terrified of being watched. It was the kind of impossible situation that came from having every choice stripped away, every moment of vulnerability turned into an opportunity for someone else's cruelty. "I'll be right outside the door," he promised. "Close enough to hear if you need anything, far enough to give you privacy. Is that all right?" She nodded quickly, relief evident in her posture. Matthew stepped out into the morning sunshine, positioning himself where his shadow fell across the doorway, but his presence remained unobtrusive. The sounds from inside the barn were soft, rustling fabric, small gasps that might have been pain or simply the effort of moving with injuries. When Citlali finally called softly that she was finished, Matthew found himself looking at an entirely different person. Sarah's blue dress transformed her from a wild creature into a young woman, though one who still carried herself with the careful wariness of someone who had learned to expect pain from every interaction. The dress was indeed a bit large, but it hung on her slight frame with a simple dignity that spoke to the quality of both the garment and the woman wearing it. "Better?" Matthew asked. Citlali smoothed the skirt with hands that shook slightly. "It's very fine. Too fine for what?" Matthew prompted gently when she trailed off. "For someone like me." The words came out barely above a whisper, heavy with a self-loathing that made Matthew's chest tighten, with anger not at her but at whatever monsters had convinced this young woman that she was somehow less deserving of basic human dignity. "There is no someone like you," Matthew said firmly. "There's just Citlali, who deserves clean clothes and a safe place to rest, same as anyone else." She looked at him with those dark eyes that seemed to hold too much knowledge for someone so young. "You don't know what I am, what I've done, what was done to me." "You're right," Matthew acknowledged. "I don't know your story, but I know what I see right now, a brave young woman who survived something terrible and managed to find her way to safety. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are." Citlali's breath caught, and for a moment, Matthew thought she might cry. Instead, she wrapped her arms around herself and looked away. "You shouldn't be kind to me. It's dangerous. They will come looking." "Let them come," Matthew said with a quiet intensity that seemed to surprise even him. "This is my land, and the law is clear about a man's right to protect his property and his guests." "Guest?" Citlali tested the word as if it were foreign to her tongue. "That's what you are," Matthew confirmed upon. "A guest in my home under my protection for as long as you choose to stay." The concept seemed to overwhelm her. She sank down onto a nearby hay bale, the blue dress pooling around her like water. "I don't understand you. Most men, they want things, they take things. You ask for nothing." Matthew considered how to answer that, how to explain a philosophy of human decency that had been so absent from her experience that it seemed alien. "My father used to say that the measure of a man isn't what he can take, but what he chooses to give. Maybe that sounds foolish to you." "No," Citlali said quickly, then seemed surprised by her own vehemence. "Not foolish, just different." She was quiet for a moment, picking at the fabric of her skirt with nervous fingers. When she spoke again, her voice was so soft, Matthew had to strain to hear it. "In my village, before they came, my grandmother told stories about the old days, about warriors who protected the weak, not because they had to, but because it was right. I thought those were just stories. Maybe they weren't, Matthew suggested. Maybe there are still people in the world who believe in doing right just because it's right. Citlali lifted her eyes to his face, studying him with an intensity that made him feel exposed. Are you one of those people? I try to be, Matthew said honestly. Don't always succeed, but I try. The morning sun was climbing higher now, streaming through the barn's open doors and painting everything in the warm, golden light. Matthew's horses nickered softly in their stalls, content now that the storm had passed, and their world had returned to something approaching normal. It was peaceful, almost idyllic, but Matthew could see the tension still coiled in Citlali's shoulders, the way her eyes never stopped moving, always watching for threats. Are you hungry? He asked, nodding toward the basket of food he'd brought. You should eat something. Citlali's stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, and she looked embarrassed. Yes, thank you. Matthew pulled out bread and beef, arranging them on a clean cloth. Citlali reached for the food with obvious hunger, but forced herself to eat slowly, carefully, as if she'd learned not to trust even the most basic comforts. Matthew found himself thinking about his own meals these past 3 years, eaten alone at a table that felt too large in a house that echoed with emptiness. Somehow, watching Citlali eat with such careful gratitude made him realize how much he'd taken for granted. It's good, she said softly, and Matthew was struck by how such a simple statement could carry so much wonder. Sarah was the real cook in this house, Matthew admitted. I mostly just heat things up these days. Maybe you could show me some Apache cooking if you'd like, when you're feeling stronger. The suggestion seemed to startle her. You would want to learn? Why wouldn't I? Matthew asked, genuinely curious about her surprise. Citlali was quiet for a long moment, as if trying to work through a complex problem. Most white people think Apache food is savage, uncivilized. Most white people are fools, Matthew said bluntly, and was rewarded with what might have been the ghost of a smile. I'd be honored to learn from you. That word honored seemed to hit her like a physical blow. She set down her bread with shaking hands and looked at him with an expression of such raw vulnerability that Matthew felt his heart clench. You don't understand, she whispered. What I am now, what they made me, I'm not clean anymore. I'm not worthy of honor. The pain in her voice was like a knife to Matthew's chest. He wanted to reach out to offer comfort, but he could see how carefully she held herself apart, how the mere suggestion of physical contact would probably send her fleeing. Instead, he chose his words with the same care he might use with a spooked horse. Whatever was done to you, he said quietly, it doesn't change who you are. It doesn't make you less worthy of respect or kindness or honor. The people who hurt you, they're the ones without honor. You survived, you escaped, you're here and you're alive, and that makes you stronger than any of them. Citlali's face crumpled, and for a moment Matthew thought she would break down entirely. Instead, she pressed her hands to her mouth and fought for control, her whole body shaking with the effort of containing whatever emotions were threatening to overwhelm her. I want to believe you, she finally managed, but I don't know how. You don't have to believe it all at once, Matthew said gently. Trust takes time. Healing takes time. I told you I'd wait until you're ready, and I meant it. She stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for some sign of deception or hidden agenda. Finding none, she nodded slowly and picked up her bread again, taking small, careful bites as if the act of eating was still something she had to think about. The day progressed with careful slowness. Matthew went about his usual ranch work, but he found himself staying close to the barn, always within earshot should Citlali need anything. He could see her through the open doors, sometimes sitting quietly, sometimes pacing with the restless energy of someone accustomed to constant vigilance. Occasionally, she would watch him work with his horses, her dark eyes following his movements with what seemed like professional interest. It was late afternoon when she finally spoke to him again without prompting. Your horses, she said, as he led his stallion Thunder back to his stall. They trust you. Matthew glanced over at her, noting how she'd positioned herself near the barn door, where she could see both him and any potential escape routes. Trust has to be earned, he said simply. With horses, with people, same principle. How do you earn it? The question came out almost involuntarily, as if she'd asked it before she could stop herself. Matthew considered the question seriously as he unsaddled Thunder, running his hands over the stallion's flanks with practiced ease. Consistency, mostly. Being the same person every day, whether they're watching or not. Never making promises you can't keep. Showing them that your strength isn't a threat to them. Citlali moved closer, though she stayed carefully out of reach. This one, she said, nodding toward Thunder, he was not always tame. Wild Mustang, Matthew confirmed. Caught him about 2 years ago. Took months before he'd let me near him without trying to kick my head off. But now he follows you like a dog. There was wonder in her voice, as if she were witnessing something magical. Now he knows I won't hurt him, Matthew said. Makes all the difference. Citlali fell silent again, but Matthew could practically hear her thinking. When she spoke next, her voice was carefully neutral. Among my people, horses are sacred. They carry warriors into battle, help us hunt, connect us to the spirit world. Your people know horses, Matthew observed. I've heard the Apache are the finest riders on the plains. Something flickered in Citlali's eyes, pride perhaps, or pain, at the reminder of all she'd lost. My father taught me to ride before I could walk properly, said I had the gift that horses spoke to me in ways they didn't speak to others. Do you miss it? Matthew asked gently. Riding. The question hit her like a physical blow. She wrapped her arms around herself and turned away, but not before Matthew saw the tears that sprang to her eyes. I miss everything, she whispered. Burn, my family, my horse, my home, the way the wind felt in my hair when I rode across the desert. I miss being myself instead of... She gestured helplessly at her own body, as if it had betrayed her somehow. You're still yourself, Matthew said firmly. Hurt maybe, changed certainly, but still yourself underneath it all. How can you know that? Citlali asked, wheeling around to face him. You don't know what they did, what they made me do, how they broke me. Matthew set down Thunder's saddle and turned to face her, fully his expression grave but gentle. Because broken things can be mended. I've seen it with horses, with people, with my own heart after Sarah died. The cracks might always show, but that doesn't mean you can't be whole again. I will never be whole again, Citlali said with flat certainty. Some things cannot be undone. Maybe not, Matthew admitted, but that doesn't mean you can't find a different kind of wholeness, a different way to be yourself. She stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked to Thunder's stall. The stallion nickered softly as she approached, and to Matthew's amazement she reached out tentatively to touch his nose. Thunder, who barely tolerated anyone besides Matthew, stood perfectly still under her gentle touch. He's beautiful, Citlali murmured, her voice thick with emotion, strong, free. Would you like to brush him? Matthew offered carefully. I was about to give him his evening grooming. Citlali's hand stilled on Thunder's nose. I don't know. It's been so long since... There's no pressure, Matthew said quickly. Just an offer. Thunder could use the attention, and sometimes taking care of something else helps us take care of ourselves. She considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I would like that. If you think he would accept me. Matthew handed her a soft brush, taking care not to let their fingers touch. He'd noticed how she flinched away from any possibility of contact. He's already accepting you. See how his ears are forward, how he's not shifting away. That's trust. Citlali took the brush with reverent care and began working on Thunder's coat, with movements that were initially hesitant but quickly became more confident. It was clear she'd done this before many times, and muscle memory was taking over where conscious thought faltered. My horse, she said softly as she worked, was called Ayana. It means eternal blossom. She was smaller than this one, but faster than the wind. My father gave her to me on my 15th birthday. What happened to her? Matthew asked, though he dreaded the answer. Citlali's hand stilled on Thunder's flank. Sold, like everything else, like everyone else. Her voice was carefully controlled, but Matthew could hear the grief underneath. I hope whoever has her now is kind to her. The simple resignation in those words hit Matthew harder than any outpouring of rage would have. This young woman had lost everything: family, home, freedom, dignity, and yet she could still hope for kindness toward a beloved animal. It spoke to a strength of character that no amount of abuse had been able to destroy. Tell me about her, Matthew said gently, about Ayana. And so, as the afternoon sun slanted low through the barn doors, Citlali began to speak. Haltingly at first, then, with growing confidence, she told him about her horse, her family, her village. She spoke of morning rides across the desert, of racing her cousins between the mesas of the way. Ayana would nicker softly in greeting whenever Citlali approached her corral. Matthew listened without interruption, understanding that this was more than just conversation. It was a kind of reclamation, a way for Citlali to remember who she had been before her world was torn apart. As she spoke, some of the tension left her shoulders, and her voice grew stronger, more sure. You were happy, Matthew observed when she finally fell silent. Yes, Citlali said simply. I was happy. I didn't know then how precious that was, how easily it could be taken away. Maybe it wasn't taken, Matthew suggested carefully. Maybe it was buried, waiting for the right time to surface again. Citlali looked at him with something that might have been hope, quickly suppressed. You think I could be happy again after everything? I think you're stronger than you know, Matthew said. And I think happiness has a way of finding us when we least expect it, if we're brave enough to let it. She was quiet for a long moment, her hand still moving the brush over Thunder's coat in long, soothing strokes. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. I'm not brave. I ran away. I hid. I let them. I didn't fight hard enough. You survived, Matthew said firmly. That took more courage than you know. Fighting isn't always about weapons and violence, Citlali. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply refuse to let them break your spirit completely. They came close, she admitted. Closer than I want to remember. But they didn't succeed, Matthew pointed out. You're here. You're talking to me about your horse, about happiness. You're still Citlali, still the girl who rode like the wind and had the gift with horses. They couldn't take that away from you, no matter what else they did. Tears were flowing freely down her cheeks now, but they seemed to be a different kind of tears. Not the desperate, hopeless sobs of the night before, but something cleaner, more healing. She leaned her forehead against Thunder's neck, and the big stallion stood perfectly still, as if he understood the significance of the moment. I don't know how to be her again, Citlali whispered. The girl I was before. She feels like someone from a dream. Maybe you don't have to be her again, Matthew said softly. Maybe you just have to be willing to become whoever you're meant to be now. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Matthew and Citlali worked side by side in comfortable silence, tending to the horses that had somehow become the bridge between her past and whatever future might await her. It was a small beginning, fragile as new grass after a hard winter, but it was a beginning nonetheless. The days that followed settled into a rhythm as natural and necessary as breathing. Each morning Matthew would find Citlali already awake in the barn, sitting with her back against the wall where she could see both entrances, her dark eyes tracking every shadow and sound. She never seemed to truly sleep, just dozed fitfully between bouts of vigilant watching, as if relaxation itself had become a luxury she could no longer afford. On the fourth morning, Matthew brought her breakfast to find her standing beside Thunder's stall, her hand resting on the stallion's neck with an ease that spoke of growing trust between them. The sight stopped him in his tracks, not because it was unusual, but because for just a moment, watching her gentle interaction with the horse, he could see glimpses of who she might have been before the world had shown her its cruelest face. "He's been waiting for you," Matthew observed, setting down the tray of food he'd prepared. "Started pacing about an hour ago, looking toward the barn door like he knew you'd be coming." Citlali's lips curved in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Animals know things, feel things that people miss." She paused, then added more quietly, "He feels safe with you. That's why he trusts me, because you trust me." "Smart horse," Matthew said, and this time her smile was unmistakable, though it faded quickly as if she'd caught herself in an unguarded moment. "You brought eggs," she noticed, looking at the breakfast tray with something approaching wonder. "Fresh this morning. The hens have been productive lately." Matthew settled himself on a hay bale, maintaining the careful distance that had become their unspoken agreement. "My neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, brought over some preserves yesterday. Said she had extra and thought I might enjoy them." Citlali picked up a piece of bread spread with the golden preserve, took a tentative bite, and closed her eyes as if savoring the sweetness. "It's been so long since I tasted anything like this. Something made with care." The word hung between them, heavy with implication. Matthew found himself wondering about the other tastes she'd become accustomed to: fear, desperation, survival. How long had it been since she'd experienced the simple pleasure of food prepared with love? "Mrs. Henderson would be pleased to hear that," Matthew said. "She takes pride in her preserves, wins the county fair every year running." "She sounds kind," Citlali said carefully. "She is. Lost her husband last winter, so she understands something about being alone." Matthew paused, weighing his words. "She's also discreet. Doesn't ask questions that aren't her business, doesn't spread gossip." Citlali's eyes sharpened, catching the underlying message. "You're thinking about other people. What to tell them?" "Eventually, people will notice you're here," Matthew said honestly. "This ranch isn't completely isolated. I have neighbors, workers who come by occasionally. I want you to feel prepared for that, not surprised by it." The anxiety that flickered across her face was immediate and intense. "What will you tell them?" "That depends on what you want me to tell them," Matthew replied. "Truth is usually simplest, but I understand if you're not ready for that." Citlali set down her bread, her appetite apparently gone. "The truth would put you in danger. There are people looking for me, bad people with money and influence." "Let me worry about that," Matthew said firmly. "You focus on healing. Let me worry about protecting us both." "Us?" The word came out as barely a whisper. Matthew realized what he'd said and felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I just meant, I know what you meant." Citlali interrupted softly. "I'm just not used to being part of an us anymore. It's strange." They fell into silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Over the past few days, they'd learned to exist in each other's presence without constant need for conversation. Matthew had discovered that Citlali was an observer by nature, someone who processed the world through careful watching, rather than endless questions. She seemed to find comfort in his steady presence, in the predictable routine of ranch work, in the way he moved through his days with quiet purpose. It was while they sat in this companionable quiet that the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both freeze. Citlali was on her feet instantly, pressed back against the wall with that familiar look of terror flooding her features. Matthew stood more slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle he kept mounted near the barn door. "Easy," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to Citlali or himself. Could be anyone, probably just a neighbor. But even as he said it, Matthew felt unease creep up his spine. The riders, for there were clearly more than one, were approaching fast with the kind of purposeful urgency that rarely brought good news. Citlali had backed herself into the far corner of the barn, making herself as small as possible behind a stack of hay bales. "Matthew," The voice that called out was familiar, and Matthew felt some of his tension ease. It was Doc Patterson from town, and with him rode Sheriff Coleman and two other men Matthew didn't immediately recognize. "In here, Doc," Matthew called back, stepping out of the barn, but positioning himself carefully in the doorway. Behind him, he could hear Citlali's rapid, shallow breathing, but she remained hidden. Doc Patterson was a man in his 50s, graying at the temples, but still vital, with the kind of steady hands and calm demeanor that made him invaluable on the frontier. Sheriff Coleman was younger, maybe 40, with a reputation for fairness that had served him well in a territory where justice could be as shifting as desert sand. "Matthew," Doc said, dismounting with the easy grace of a man who'd spent his life on horseback. "We need to talk." "About what?" Matthew asked, though his gut was already telling him the answer. Sheriff Coleman stepped forward, his expression grave. "We've had reports of a missing Apache girl, runaway from a work farm south of here. Owners claiming she's dangerous, possibly carrying disease. Says she attacked several people before she escaped." Matthew felt his jaw clench. "Work farm, legal operation," one of the strangers said, stepping forward. He was a well-dressed man with cold eyes and the kind of soft hands that spoke of never having done honest labor. "My associate and I represent the interests of Mr. Garrett Morrison. The girl in question is his legal property, contracted for a period of 5 years to work off tribal debts." "Property," Matthew repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "Legally speaking, yes." The man continued, apparently oblivious to the warning in Matthew's tone. "We have documentation proving ownership, and we're authorized to retrieve her by any means necessary." Behind Matthew, he heard the softest sound, a kind of broken whimper that made his blood run cold. Citlali was listening to every word, hearing herself described as property to be retrieved like a lost horse or stolen cow. "Haven't seen any Apache girls around here," Matthew said steadily, "runaway or otherwise." Doc Patterson was studying Matthew's face with the sharp attention of a man accustomed to reading people. "Matthew, if you know something—" "I know that calling a human being property is about as unchristian as it gets," Matthew said firmly. "I know that any operation that needs to hunt down its workers probably isn't treating them right in the first place." Sheriff Coleman held up a hand. "Now, Matthew, I understand your feelings on the matter, but the law is the law. If this girl is on your property—" "She's not," Matthew said firmly. It wasn't exactly a lie. Citlali had never been his property, never belonged to anyone but herself. The well-dressed stranger stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You wouldn't mind if we searched your property then, just to be thorough?" Matthew's hand moved imperceptibly closer to his rifle. "I would mind. This is private land, and you're not welcome here." "We have legal authority," the stranger began. "You have papers from a man who claims to own people." Matthew cut him off. "That kind of authority doesn't mean much to me." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sheriff Coleman looked uncomfortable, caught between the letter of the law and what his conscience was telling him. Doc Patterson continued to study Matthew with those sharp eyes, as if trying to read the truth written in his posture. "Matthew," Doc said quietly, "if someone needed medical attention, someone who'd been hurt, scared, traumatized, you'd want them to get proper care, wouldn't you?" It was a careful question loaded with implication. Doc Patterson had always been a man who put human welfare above legal technicalities, and Matthew found himself wondering if the doctor suspected more than he was letting on. "If I knew someone like that," Matthew said slowly, "I'd want to make sure they felt safe before anything else. Scared people need time to heal, not more trauma." "Time," Doc repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, healing takes time, sometimes a lot of time." The well-dressed stranger was growing impatient. "Sheriff, if you won't search this property properly, we'll be forced to report your lack of cooperation to the territorial authorities." Sheriff Coleman's face flushed red. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Lewis?" "I'm simply stating facts," Lewis replied coldly. Mr. Morrison has invested considerable resources in retrieving his property. He won't be pleased if local authorities prove uncooperative." From inside the barn came another sound, a soft sob that was quickly stifled. Matthew hoped the others hadn't heard it, but he saw Doc Patterson's eyes sharpen with concern. "Tell you what," Matthew said, thinking fast. "Why don't you gentlemen ride on back to town? If I see any sign of your missing girl, I'll be sure to let Sheriff Coleman know." "That's not good enough," Lewis snapped. "We know she's in this area. Local tracks. Could belong to anyone," Matthew interrupted. "Lot of people travel these roads." The second stranger, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up. His voice was rougher than Lewis's, with the kind of hard edge that came from violence. "Maybe we should check that barn real careful like. Girl might be hiding in there." Matthew shifted his position slightly, blocking the barn entrance more completely. "That barn's full of horses worth more than your yearly salary. You spook them, someone's going to pay for the damage." "Is that a threat?" Lewis demanded. "It's a fact," Matthew replied calmly. "Thunder alone is worth $300. You want to explain to a judge why you cost me money searching for someone who isn't here?" Sheriff Coleman seemed to reach a decision. "That's enough. We've asked our questions. Mr. Sandival has given his answers. Unless you have specific evidence of wrongdoing, we're done here." "This is highly irregular," Lewis protested. "We have rights. You have the right to leave my property," Matthew said firmly. "I suggest you exercise it." Doc Patterson swung back up into his saddle, but his eyes remained fixed on Matthew. "If anyone needs medical attention," he said carefully, "they know where to find me, day or night." The message was clear, and Matthew nodded slightly. "I'll keep that in mind, Doc." As the riders prepared to leave, Lewis leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "This isn't over, Sandival. Mr. Morrison doesn't give up easy, and neither do we. If that girl is here, we'll find her eventually." "If she was here," Matthew replied evenly, "she'd be under my protection, and I take protecting what's mine very seriously." The words carried a weight that made Lewis's eyes narrow, but Sheriff Coleman was already turning his horse, clearly eager to put distance between himself and a situation that was growing more complicated by the minute. "Come on," the sheriff called. "We've got other leads to follow." Matthew watched until the riders disappeared over the ridge before finally allowing himself to breathe properly. Behind him, he could hear Citlali emerging from her hiding place, her movements careful and shaky. "They're gone," he said without turning around, giving her time to compose herself. "For now." Citlali's voice was thick with tears and terror. "But they'll be back. That man Lewis, he works for them, for the people who bought me." Matthew turned slowly, seeing her standing in the barn doorway with tears streaming down her face. The blue dress that had made her look so dignified just hours before now seemed to hang on her frame like a shroud, emphasizing how small and vulnerable she really was. "They called me property," she whispered taut, "like I'm not even human." "You heard all that?" Matthew asked gently. Citlali nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. "Every word. They have papers, legal papers that say I belong to someone else." Matthew felt fury rise in his chest. Not the hot, explosive kind, but the cold, calculating anger that burned slow and steady. "Papers can be challenged, laws can be changed." "Not for people like me," Citlali said with bitter certainty. "Not for Apache girls with no family, no money, no voice." "You have a voice," Matthew said firmly, "and you're not alone." She looked at him with desperate hope, warring with learned helplessness. "How can you fight them? They have the law on their side." "Sometimes the law is wrong," Matthew said simply. "When it is good, people have to stand up and say so. You could be arrested. They could take your ranch, ruin your life." Citlali's voice broke. "I can't let that happen because of me." Matthew stepped closer, stopping just outside her personal space, but close enough that she could see the determination in his eyes. "Let me ask you something. If the situations were reversed, If I was the one in trouble and you had the power to help, what would you do? The question seemed to catch her off guard. She stared at him for a long moment, considering. I would help, she said finally quietly, even if it meant risking your own safety. Yes. Then you understand why I can't just turn you over to those men, Matthew said. It's not about being a hero or proving something. It's about being able to look at myself in the mirror and not seeing a coward. Citlali's face crumpled, and for a moment Matthew thought she might collapse entirely. Instead, she straightened her shoulders with visible effort, finding some reserve of strength he was beginning to recognize as essentially her. What do we do? She asked. The word "we" hit Matthew like a physical blow, carrying with it implications and responsibilities that should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since Sarah's death. First, we make sure you're truly safe, he said. That means being prepared for them to come back, probably with more men and legal backing. They'll search the ranch next time, Citlali said. They won't just take your word. Matthew nodded grimly. Probably, which means we need to be smarter about this. He was quiet for a moment, thinking through possibilities. The ranch was large, with plenty of places to hide, but a determined search would eventually turn up any hiding spot. They needed something more permanent, more legally sound. There might be a way, he said slowly, but it would require you to trust me completely, to trust that I would never use that trust against you. Citlali tilted her head, studying his face. What kind of way? Matthew took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to suggest would change everything between them. Marriage. The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Citlali went very still, her face cycling through a dozen different emotions: shock, fear, confusion, and something that might have been hope. Marriage, she repeated flatly. Legal marriage, Matthew clarified quickly. In the eyes of the law, a married woman has protections that a single woman doesn't, especially an Apache woman. If you were my wife, legally my wife, those men couldn't touch you without going through me first. Citlali was shaking her head slowly, as if trying to process an impossible concept. You would marry me, knowing what I am, what was done to me. I would marry Citlali, Matthew said firmly. The brave young woman who survived hell and still has enough compassion left to worry about my safety. The woman who has the gift with horses and remembers her grandmother's stories. The woman who chose to trust me when trust was the hardest thing in the world for her to give. Tears were flowing freely down her cheeks now. You don't understand what you're offering. Marriage means whatever we decide it means, Matthew interrupted gently. I'm not asking you to be a wife in any way that makes you uncomfortable. I'm offering you legal protection, my name and my promise that you'll never have to face those men alone again. But what about love? Citlali asked the question, coming out raw and vulnerable. What about what married people are supposed to feel for each other? Matthew was quiet for a long moment, considering how to answer that honestly. I loved my wife Sarah with everything I had. I thought that part of my heart died with her, but friendship, respect, caring for someone's welfare, those aren't nothing. Those can be enough to build a life on. And if I'm never able to be a real wife to you, the question was barely audible. If I'm too broken, too damaged, then we'll be two people who care about each other, living under the same roof and facing the world together, Matthew said simply. That's more than a lot of married couples have. Citlali stared at him for a long time, searching his face for some sign of deception or hidden agenda. Finding none, she slowly sank down onto a hay bale, her legs apparently no longer able to support her. You would really do this, she whispered. Marry someone like me. I would be honored to marry you, Matthew said, and the sincerity in his voice made her flinch as if he'd struck her. I don't know how to be married, she said desperately. I don't know how to be anything but afraid. Neither do I, Matthew admitted. I've been alone for 3 years. I've forgotten how to share space with another person, how to consider someone else's needs alongside my own. We'd have to figure it out together. The idea seemed to overwhelm her. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with the effort of containing her emotions. "You're asking me to choose," she said finally, "between being property and being what your burden. You're asking me to choose to trust that you won't regret saving me when you realize how damaged I really am." Matthew felt his heart clench at the pain in her voice. He wanted desperately to reach out to offer physical comfort, but he knew better than to make that mistake. "You're not damaged," he said firmly. "You're hurt. There's a difference. Damaged things are broken beyond repair. Hurt things can heal." "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've been hurt too," Matthew said quietly. "Different kind of hurt, but hurt all the same. And I've learned that sometimes the only way to heal is to let someone else care about your welfare." Citlali lifted her head, looking at him with red-rimmed eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. "If I said yes, if I agreed to this, what would happen? How would it work?" "We'd ride into town tomorrow," Matthew said. "Talk to Judge Morrison, different Morrison than the one hunting you, thankfully. He's a decent man who believes in justice over technicality. We'd get married legally, properly, with witnesses and documentation that couldn't be challenged. And then you'd be Mrs. Citlali Sandival with all the rights and protections that name carries. Any man who wanted to take you somewhere would have to go through your husband first." The word husband seemed to hit her like a physical blow. She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking slightly. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I'm so scared of everything, of them finding me, of being alone, of trusting someone and having them betray me, of saying yes and ruining your life, of saying no and losing the only safety I've ever known." "Fear is reasonable," Matthew said gently. "After what you've been through, fear is the smartest response you could have. But don't let it make your decisions for you." Citlali was quiet for a long time, staring out through the barn door at the mountains in the distance. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, despite the tears still flowing down her cheeks. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "and if we do this thing, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me that if you ever regret it, if I ever become more trouble than you bargained for, you'll tell me. Don't suffer in silence trying to be noble. I couldn't bear knowing I trapped you in something that made you unhappy." Matthew felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of grief he hadn't even realized he was still carrying. This broken, terrified girl was worried about his happiness, about being a burden to someone who had already promised to protect her. "I promise," he said solemnly. "Do I get a promise in return?" Citlali nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Promise me you'll try," Matthew said. "Not to be someone you're not to heal faster than you're able to, but just to try. To trust me when I say you're safe. To believe me when I tell you you're worth protecting. To let yourself hope even if it's scary." "I promise to try," Citlali whispered. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, two broken people sat in a weathered barn and chose to bind their futures together. It wasn't the romantic proposal of storybooks nor the passionate declaration of undying love that filled dime novels. It was something altogether more practical and perhaps more precious, a promise to stand together against whatever storms might come, to offer each other shelter in a world that had shown them both its capacity for cruelty. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears to face and obstacles to overcome. But tonight, for the first time since her world had been destroyed, Citlali fell asleep without keeping one eye open for danger. And for the first time since Sarah's death, Matthew Sandival allowed himself to hope that his house might once again become a home. The morning of their wedding dawned clear and cold, with frost painting delicate patterns on the barn windows and the distant mountains standing sharp against a sky the color of Sarah's best china. Matthew had been awake since before sunrise, not from anxiety, but from a strange sense of anticipation that he hadn't felt in years. Today would change everything, and for the first time since Sarah's death, that prospect didn't fill him with dread. He found Citlali exactly where he'd expected, sitting beside Thunder's stall, her hand resting on the stallion's nose as if drawing strength from his steady presence. She wore Sarah's blue dress again, the one that had transformed her from a wild creature into a young woman, but this morning she'd braided her long black hair with strips of leather in a pattern that spoke of her Apache heritage. It was a small act of defiance, perhaps, or simply a way of honoring who she was before she became someone new. "Ready?" Matthew asked gently, though he could see the answer in the tight set of her shoulders and the way her free hand trembled against her skirt. "No," Citlali admitted with brutal honesty, "but I don't think anyone ever really is for something like this." Matthew settled beside her on the hay bale, maintaining their careful distance while offering what comfort his presence could provide. "Judge Morrison is a good man. He won't make this harder than it needs to be. And after," Citlali's voice was barely audible, "when those men come back with their papers and their threats, then they'll find Mrs. Matthew Sandival a free woman with a husband who takes his vows seriously." Matthew's voice carried a quiet conviction that seemed to ease some of the tension from her frame. "Whatever happens, you won't face it alone." The ride to town passed in relative silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts as the landscape rolled by beneath Thunder's steady hooves. Citlali rode behind Matthew, her arms wrapped around his waist, with a grip that spoke of deep-seated terror barely held in check. Every time they crested a hill or rounded a bend, she tensed as if expecting to see Lewis and his men waiting for them, but the road remained empty, except for the occasional rabbit or prairie dog scurrying through the sagebrush. Clearwater wasn't much of a town, a main street lined with false-fronted buildings that tried to look more substantial than they were, a handful of side streets that petered out into desert after a few blocks, and a population that numbered maybe 300 souls on a good day. But it was civilization, and more importantly, it was where Judge Morrison held court every other Thursday. They found the judge in his office above the general store, a spare room that served as both courthouse and meeting hall, depending on the day's needs. Judge Morrison was a tall, thin man in his 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He'd been dispensing frontier justice for more than 20 years, and his reputation for fairness had earned him respect throughout the territory. "Matthew," the judge said warmly as they entered, then paused as he took in Citlali's presence. His eyes sharpened with interest but not suspicion. "And who might this young lady be?" "This is Citlali," Matthew said simply. "We'd like to be married if you're willing to perform the ceremony." Judge Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained neutral. "I see. And Miss Citlali, is this something you want as well?" Citlali's grip on Matthew's arm tightened, but she managed to meet the judge's eyes. "Yes, sir, I want to marry Matthew." "Well then," Judge Morrison said, settling behind his desk, "we'll need to take care of a few formalities first. Names, ages, that sort of thing." As they worked through the paperwork, Matthew found himself watching Citlali carefully for signs that she might bolt. But she answered each question with quiet dignity, her voice growing steadier as the process continued. When Judge Morrison asked about her family, she simply said they were deceased, and something in her tone warned against further inquiry. "We'll need witnesses," the judge explained as he prepared the marriage certificate. "Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house is usually willing, and I believe Doc Patterson is in town today as well." Within half an hour they were standing before Judge Morrison, in what passed for the town's ceremonial space, a corner of the general store cleared of merchandise and decorated with a few wildflowers that Mrs. Patterson had hastily gathered. Doc Patterson stood to one side, his sharp eyes missing nothing, while his wife served as the second witness. "Dearly beloved," Judge Morrison began, his voice taking on the formal cadence of ceremony, We are gathered here today to join Matthew Sandival and Citlali in holy matrimony. The words washed over Matthew like a river, familiar yet strange. 3 years ago, he'd never imagined standing here again, promising to love and cherish another woman. But as he looked at Citlali's profile, saw the way she held herself with such careful dignity despite the fear he knew was coursing through her, he realized this wasn't about replacing what he'd had with Sarah. This was something entirely different, a partnership born of necessity perhaps, but no less real for that. "Matthew," Judge Morrison said, "do you take Citlali to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" "I do," Matthew said firmly, his voice carrying across the small space with quiet conviction. "And Citlali," the judge continued, "do you take Matthew to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" Citlali's voice was barely a whisper, but it was steady. "I do." "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of New Mexico, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Judge Morrison smiled kindly. "Matthew, you may kiss your bride." The moment stretched between them, heavy with implication. Matthew could see the panic flickering in Citlali's eyes, the way her body tensed, as if preparing to flee. Instead of moving toward her, he simply reached out and took her hand, lifting it gently to his lips and placing a soft kiss on her knuckles. "Hello, Mrs. Sandival," he murmured, and was rewarded with a tremulous smile that transformed her entire face. The paperwork was completed with efficient precision, Judge Morrison's pen scratching across official documents that would stand as legal proof of their union. As Matthew watched his new wife sign her name in careful, precise letters, he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a mantle. This woman was now his to protect, in the eyes of the law and in his own heart. They were just preparing to leave when the sound of approaching horses made everyone in the room freeze. Matthew moved instinctively to position himself between Citlali and the door, his hand moving to the gun at his hip. Through the window he could see Lewis and his companion riding up the main street, with 3 additional men, all armed and all wearing expressions that spoke of serious intent. "Trouble?" Judge Morrison asked quietly, his own hand moving to the rifle he kept behind his desk. "Could be," Matthew replied grimly. "Those men are hunting for Citlali. They claim she's a runaway from a work farm." Judge Morrison's expression hardened. "I see. And now she's a married woman with legal protections they can't touch," Matthew said with grim satisfaction. The door burst open without ceremony, Lewis striding in with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. His eyes swept the room, fixing on Citlali with predatory intensity. "There she is," he said with obvious satisfaction. "I told you we'd find her eventually." "Find who?" Judge Morrison asked, mildly rising from behind his desk with the kind of calm authority that came from years of dealing with difficult men. "The runaway Apache girl," Lewis snapped. "We have legal documentation proving she belongs to Mr. Morrison's operation." "Different Morrison," the judge said dryly, "and I'm afraid you're mistaken about the young lady's status." Lewis's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Judge Morrison said, lifting the freshly signed marriage certificate, "that Mrs. Citlali Sandival is a free married woman with all the rights and protections that status entails under territorial law." The silence that followed was so complete that Matthew could hear his own heartbeat. Lewis stared at the document as if it were written in a foreign language, his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and calculation. "That's impossible," he said finally. "She's property. We have contracts. You have contracts with an unmarried Apache woman," Judge Morrison interrupted smoothly. "Mrs. Sandival is a married white woman. She's not white. Lewis exploded. She's married to a white man, which makes her a white woman in the eyes of the law, Judge Morrison said with unshakable calm. Those are the rules you people wrote, Mr. Lewis. I suggest you live by them. Matthew watched Lewis's face turn an alarming shade of red as the legal implications sank in. Citlali pressed closer to Matthew's side, her hand finding his arm and gripping it like a lifeline. This is fraud, Lewis snarled, a sham marriage designed to circumvent legal contracts. This is a marriage performed by a territorial judge with proper witnesses and documentation. Judge Morrison replied firmly. If you have complaints about the legality of the union, you're welcome to file them with the territorial court. Until then, I suggest you respect Mrs. Sandival's rights as a married woman. One of Lewis's companions stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun. Maybe we should take this up with the lady directly, see if she wants to honor her previous commitments. The threat was clear, and Matthew felt his own hand move to his weapon. But before anyone could draw, Doc Patterson stepped between them with the kind of calm authority that came from years of dealing with life-and-death situations. Gentlemen, he said pleasantly, I think there's been a misunderstanding here. Mrs. Sandival is under my medical care for injuries sustained during her previous employment. Any attempt to remove her from that care would be detrimental to her health, and I'd be obligated to report such interference to the Territorial Medical Board. It was a masterful piece of improvisation, and Matthew felt a surge of gratitude for the doctor's quick thinking. Lewis looked around the room, taking in the unified front they presented, and seemed to realize that his usual tactics of intimidation weren't going to work here. This isn't over, he said finally, his voice low and dangerous. Mr. Morrison has invested considerable resources in that girl. He's not going to just write off his losses. Mr. Morrison's losses are unfortunate, Judge Morrison said mildly, but they're not Mrs. Sandival's responsibility. I suggest he take them up with whoever sold him a contract on a woman he didn't legally own. Lewis's jaw worked as if he were chewing nails, but he seemed to recognize that he was outmaneuvered, at least for the moment. We'll be in touch, he said finally, then turned and stalked out his men, following behind like a pack of disappointed wolves. The silence that followed their departure was thick with tension. Citlali was shaking so badly that Matthew was afraid she might collapse, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders in a gesture that was purely protective. Well, Judge Morrison said cheerfully, as if armed men hadn't just threatened violence in his courtroom, that was certainly eventful. Mrs. Patterson, perhaps you could brew some tea for the new bride. She looks like she could use it. As Mrs. Patterson bustled around making tea and fussing over Citlali, like a mother hen, Doc Patterson drew Matthew aside. That was well done, the doctor said quietly, but those men aren't going away. They'll be back with more legal pressure, maybe more men. Let them come, Matthew said grimly. Citlali is my wife now. I'll protect her with everything I have. Doc Patterson studied his face for a moment, then nodded. I believe you will, but Matthew, this isn't just about standing up to bullies anymore. You've made yourself a target, and by extension, everyone who helps you. Are you prepared for what that might mean? Matthew looked across the room at his new wife, saw the way she held her teacup with hands that still trembled, saw the gratitude and fear warring in her dark eyes. Doc, I buried the only woman I ever loved 3 years ago. I thought that was the end of happiness for me, that I'd spend the rest of my life just going through the motions. But that girl, she's shown me that there are different kinds of love, different ways to build a life with someone. I won't let them take that away from either of us. The doctor nodded slowly. Then you'll need allies. People who believe in what you're doing and are willing to stand with you when things get difficult. Are you offering? I'm saying that good people have to stick together, Doc Patterson replied, and from where I'm sitting, you two are definitely the good people in this situation. The ride back to the ranch was subdued. Both Matthew and Citlali lost in their own thoughts about what they'd just committed to. The marriage certificate was safely tucked in Matthew's pocket, a piece of paper that had transformed Citlali from a hunted runaway into a protected wife. But they both knew that legal protections only went so far, especially when dealing with men who had shown little regard for law or decency. As they crested the final hill before the ranch, Citlali broke the silence that had stretched between them. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what? For not kissing me in front of all those people. You could have. It would have been your right as my husband, but you didn't." Matthew felt his throat tighten at the gratitude in her voice, at the reminder of how little control she'd had over her own body for so long. "Citlali, I need you to understand something. What happened in that courthouse, the papers we signed, they don't give me rights over you. They give me responsibilities to you. There's a difference." She was quiet for a moment, processing that distinction. "Other men wouldn't see it that way." "I'm not other men," Matthew said simply. As they approached the barn, thunder nickered a greeting that seemed to lift some of the weight from Citlali's shoulders. Animals, Matthew had learned, were often better medicine than anything Doc Patterson could prescribe. They didn't judge, didn't demand explanations, didn't not expect more than you were able to give. "What happens now?" Citlali asked as they dismounted. "I mean, tonight, where do I—" The question hung between them, heavy with implication and anxiety. Matthew had been dreading this moment, knowing it would require them to navigate the practical realities of their new situation. "The house has 3 bedrooms, he said carefully. "Sarah and I use the main one, but there's a guest room that gets good light and has its own washstand. You're welcome to that space. Make it your own however you'd like." Relief flooded her features so completely that Matthew felt his heart clench. She'd been afraid, of course she'd been afraid, that marriage would mean surrendering what little autonomy she'd managed to reclaim. "And meals?" she asked. "I don't know how to cook like a white woman. I don't know the proper way to keep house or—" "We'll figure it out as we go," Matthew assured her. "I've been making do on my own for 3 years. Adding one more person to the mix can't be much harder." They settled into an awkward routine that first evening, both of them hyper-aware of the other's presence in ways they hadn't been when Citlali was simply a guest in the barn. The house felt different with another person in it. Smaller in some ways, larger in others. Sounds carried differently when there was someone else to hear them, and the silence felt more significant when it was being shared. Dinner was a quiet affair, both of them picking at their food while trying to process the enormity of what they'd done. They were married now, bound together by law and necessity, but they were still essentially strangers, learning to navigate the complex dynamics of shared space and mutual dependence. "The men who came today," Citlali said, finally breaking the silence that had grown heavy between them. "They won't give up. Louis, he's the kind of man who takes things personally when he doesn't get his way." "Then we'll have to be smarter than him," Matthew replied. "More prepared, more careful." "You don't understand," Citlali said urgently. "They have money, influence, connections. They can make life very difficult for people who oppose them." Matthew set down his fork and looked at her directly. "Citlali, I need you to trust me on this. I'm not some naive farm boy who doesn't understand how the world works. I've dealt with men like Louis before, and I know they rely on fear and intimidation because it's easier than actual confrontation. But they made a mistake today." "What mistake?" "They showed their hand," Matthew explained. "They revealed how desperate they are to get you back, which means you're more valuable to them than they want to admit. That gives us leverage." Citlali shook her head. "I'm not valuable. I'm just property they paid for, like a horse or a cow." "No," Matthew said firmly. "If you were just property, they would have written off the loss and moved on to easier targets. The fact that they're pursuing you this aggressively means there's something more at stake. Maybe you saw something you weren't supposed to see or heard something that could cause them trouble. Maybe you're the key to exposing their entire operation." The possibility seemed to hit Sitlali like a physical blow. She went very still, her face cycling through fear, realization, and something that might have been hope. "There were others," she said slowly. "Other girls, other women, some younger than me, some older. They kept us separate most of the time, but sometimes we would see each other, hear things." "What kind of things?" Sitlali wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to contain memories that threatened to overwhelm her. Names, places, men who came to visit, who paid extra for special treatment. Important men, some of them. Men who wouldn't want their names connected to a place like that. Matthew felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to click into place. That's why they want you back so badly, not because you're valuable property, but because you're a dangerous witness. "I can't testify," Sitlali said quickly, panic creeping into her voice. "I can't stand up in court and tell those stories. I can't." "You don't have to," Matthew assured her. "But knowing what you know, that's power, Sitlali. And power is something we can use to protect ourselves." As the evening wore on, they began to plan, not just for immediate safety, but for a future that neither of them had dared to imagine just days before. It was a strange kind of intimacy, this shared plotting and preparation, building trust through mutual vulnerability and common purpose. When it came time to retire for the night, they stood awkwardly in the main room of the house, both aware that this was another threshold they would have to cross. "The guest room," Matthew said gently, "is yours for as long as you want it. The door has a lock, and you're the only one with a key." Sitlali looked at him with an expression that was part gratitude, part disbelief. "You really mean that?" "I really mean that." She nodded slowly, then seemed to gather her courage for something. "Matthew, what you did today, marrying me, protecting me, standing up to those men, I know you said it wasn't about being a hero, but it was heroic all the same. I just wanted you to know that I see that, and I'm grateful." Matthew felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Sitlali, I also want you to know," she continued, "that I meant what I said in my vows. I may not know how to be a wife yet, but I know how to be loyal. I know how to stand by someone who stands by me. Whatever comes next, you won't face it alone, either." As they said their goodnights and retreated to their separate rooms, Matthew found himself thinking about the strange turns his life had taken. This morning he'd been a lonely widower going through the motions of existence. Tonight he was a married man with a purpose that extended beyond his own survival. He lay in his bed listening to the soft sounds of Sitlali moving around in the guest room, and for the first time in 3 years the silence of his house didn't feel oppressive. It felt expectant, as if the old walls were holding their breath to see what kind of life would unfold within them. Outside, the wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying with it the promise of storms to come. But inside, 2 people who had thought themselves beyond hope were discovering that sometimes the most powerful bonds are forged not in passion, but in the quiet determination to stand together against whatever darkness the world might throw at them. The marriage certificate lay on Matthew's nightstand, a simple piece of paper that had changed everything. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats to face, and obstacles to overcome. But tonight, Mrs. Sitlali Sandival slept behind a locked door in a house where she was safe, protected, and valued. And that Matthew thought, as sleep finally claimed him, was a pretty good beginning. 3 weeks passed before Lewis returned, and when he did, he brought enough men and legal documentation to outfit a small army. Matthew watched through the kitchen window as the dust cloud on the horizon resolved into a dozen riders, all armed, all wearing the grim expressions of men who'd been paid to collect a debt. Beside him, Sitlali went very still, in the way he'd learned meant she was fighting down panic. 12 of them, Matthew observed quietly, his hand moving instinctively to check his rifle. More than I expected. They mean business this time. Citlali whispered, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of the kitchen table. Lewis doesn't like to be made a fool of in public. Matthew turned from the window, taking in his wife's pale face and the fear that she was trying so hard to hide. Over the past 3 weeks, he'd watched her begin to heal in small ways, sleeping through the night, without nightmares, laughing at something thunder did, humming Apache songs while she worked in the garden they'd started together. Now all of that progress seemed to drain away as the ghosts of her past rode up to their front door. "Remember what we talked about," Matthew said, gently moving to stand beside her. "You're not the same girl who ran away in the storm. You're Mrs. Citlali Sandival now, with legal protections and a husband who takes his vows seriously." She nodded, but he could see her hands shaking. "What if the papers they have this time are better? What if they've found a way around the marriage? Then we'll deal with it," Matthew said firmly. "Together." The sound of hoofbeats grew louder as the riders approached the house. Matthew could hear Lewis's voice above the others, barking orders with the authority of a man accustomed to getting his way through force. When they finally stopped in the yard, the silence that followed seemed to ring with menace. "Sandival," Lewis's voice carried clearly through the morning air. "We need to talk." Matthew squeezed Citlali's shoulder gently, then walked to the front door. When he opened it, he found Lewis standing at the bottom of the porch steps with a man in an expensive suit who looked distinctly out of place on a frontier ranch. Behind them, 11 other men sat their horses in a loose semicircle, hands resting on weapons in a display that was clearly meant to intimidate. "Mr. Lewis," Matthew said pleasantly, as if receiving a social call. "Back so soon." "Cut the pleasantries, Sandival," Lewis snapped. "We're here on official business this time. I'd like you to meet Mr. Harrison Blackwood, attorney for Morrison Enterprises." The man in the suit stepped forward with the kind of smooth confidence that came from years of manipulating legal systems for profit. He was perhaps 50, with silver hair and cold blue eyes that appraised Matthew like a horse at auction. "Mr. Sandival," Blackwood said in a cultured Eastern accent, "I understand there's been some confusion regarding one of Mr. Morrison's contracted workers. I'm here to clear up any misunderstandings." "No misunderstandings on my end," Matthew replied evenly. "My wife is inside making breakfast. Would you gentlemen care to join us?" Blackwood's smile was thin and predatory. "Your wife? Yes, about that. I'm afraid there are some irregularities with your recent marriage that need to be addressed." Matthew felt his gut tighten, but he kept his voice level. "What kind of irregularities?" The young woman in question was contracted to Morrison Enterprises under a federal work program, Blackwood explained, pulling a thick folder from his saddlebags. "These contracts supersede territorial marriage laws when dealing with reservation Indians. I'm afraid your ceremony, while perhaps well-intentioned, has no legal standing." The words hit Matthew like a physical blow, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I'd like to see those documents." "Of course," Blackwood said smoothly, extending the folder. "You'll find everything in order, federal seal, territorial approval, all properly notarized and witnessed." Matthew took the papers with hands that he willed to remain steady. As he scanned the official-looking documents, his heart sank. They were impressive, multiple pages of legal language, official seals, signatures, from territorial and federal officials. If they were genuine, they painted a picture of Citlali as property of Morrison Enterprises for a period of 7 years, with no provision for marriage or personal autonomy. "These papers claim she agreed to a 7-year contract," Matthew said, looking up from the documents. "She was barely 17 when these were supposedly signed. Reservation Indians come of age at 16 under federal law," Blackwood replied smoothly. "The contract is perfectly legal. And if she was coerced, if she signed under duress," Blackwood's smile never wavered, "the burden of proof for such claims would rest with the accuser, given that the young woman is, shall we say, of questionable character and has already demonstrated a tendency toward deception and flight. I doubt any court would find her testimony credible." Matthew felt rage building in his chest, but he forced it down. Losing his temper would only give these men an excuse to escalate the situation. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Simple," Lewis interjected, clearly tired of legal niceties. "You turn over the girl, my wife," Matthew corrected firmly. "You turn over the woman," Lewis continued, with visible irritation, "and we'll pretend this whole marriage charade never happened. No charges filed, no legal consequences. You can go back to your lonely ranch, and we can all move on with our lives. And if I refuse," Blackwood's expression hardened, "then we'll be forced to seek legal remedies. Federal marshals, territorial courts, criminal charges of interfering with federal contracts. It could get very expensive and very unpleasant for everyone involved." Matthew handed the documents back, his mind racing. The papers looked official, but something about them felt wrong. The signatures were too clean, the seals too perfect, the language too convenient. After 3 weeks of relative peace, he'd hoped Lewis might have given up, but clearly the stakes were higher than he'd realized. "I need time to review these with my own attorney," Matthew said finally. "I'm afraid time is a luxury we can't afford," Blackwood replied. "These federal contracts have specific retrieval provisions. We're authorized to collect the contracted worker immediately." Several of the mounted men shifted in their saddles' hands, moving closer to their weapons. The threat was clear. They were prepared to take Citlali by force, if necessary. "Over my dead body," Matthew said quietly, and something in his tone made Lewis take a step back. "That can be arranged," Lewis snarled, his hand moving to his gun. The tension in the yard ratcheted up several notches, everyone aware that they were balanced on the knife's edge between negotiation and violence. Matthew could feel the weight of his rifle just inside the door, could calculate angles and cover and the number of seconds it would take to reach decent protection. But he could also feel Citlali behind him, probably listening to every word, and he knew that whatever happened next would determine not just their immediate safety, but their entire future together. It was at that moment that the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced new arrivals. Matthew looked past Lewis and his men to see a familiar figure riding hard toward the ranch. Sheriff Coleman, followed by Doc Patterson and 3 other men Matthew recognized as local ranchers. Behind them came 2 more riders who made Matthew's heart leap with relief. Judge Morrison and a man wearing the distinctive uniform of a territorial marshal. "Well, well," Judge Morrison called out as his party reined in beside Lewis's men. "Quite a gathering we have here. What's the occasion?" Blackwood stepped forward smoothly, his politician smile back in place. "Judge Morrison, how fortuitous. I'm Harrison Blackwood, attorney for Morrison Enterprises. We're here to collect a runaway worker under federal contract." "Are you now?" Judge Morrison said mildly, dismounting with the easy grace of a man half his age. "And you have the proper documentation for this collection, all in order," Blackwood assured him, producing the folder again. "Federal work contracts supersede territorial marriage laws." The territorial marshal, a lean man with steel-gray hair and weathered features, stepped forward. "I'm Marshal Davis. Mind if I take a look at those papers?" Blackwood's confidence flickered for just a moment. "Of course, Marshal, though I assure you, everything is perfectly legitimate." Marshal Davis took his time examining the documents, his expression unreadable. Behind him, Doc Patterson and the local ranchers had positioned themselves strategically around the yard, their presence shifting the balance of power in ways that weren't lost on Lewis or his men. "Interesting," Marshal Davis said finally. "Very impressive paperwork, almost too impressive, you might say." "I'm not sure what you mean," Blackwood said, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice now. "I mean," Marshal Davis continued, "that I've seen a lot of federal contracts in my time, and these have some peculiarities. The seals, for instance, are from the wrong office. And this signature here, supposedly from Territorial Governor Wallace. Well, I happen to know Governor Wallace was in Washington during the time period indicated on these documents." The silence that followed was deafening. Matthew watched Blackwood's face cycle through confusion. calculation and the beginning of real fear as the implications sank in. "There must be some mistake," Blackwood said quickly. "These documents came directly from federal offices in Santa Fe." "Oh, I'm sure they did," Marshal Davis agreed pleasantly. Question is, which federal offices? Because the ones I'm familiar with don't issue contracts for human beings. That practice was outlawed by federal statute in 1868. Lewis was looking back and forth between Blackwood and the marshal, with the expression of a man who suddenly realized he might have been lied to. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Marshal Davis continued, "that whoever prepared these documents committed several federal crimes. Forgery of government documents, impersonation of federal officials, conspiracy to violate civil rights laws. The penalties for such crimes are quite severe." Matthew felt something that might have been hope beginning to bloom in his chest. Behind him he heard the soft sound of the front door opening and knew that Citlali had decided to join them. She appeared at his shoulder, her face pale but determined, wearing the blue dress that had become her armor against the world. "Mrs. Sandival," Judge Morrison said warmly, tipping his hat. "How lovely to see you again." The simple gesture, treating her as a respectable married woman in front of these men who had hunted her like an animal, seemed to give Citlali strength. She lifted her chin and looked directly at Lewis for the first time since that terrifying night in the barn. "Mr. Lewis," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "Still collecting people like livestock, I see." Lewis's face flushed red with rage. "You little..." "Careful," Matthew interrupted, his voice low and dangerous. "That's my wife you're talking to." The confrontation might have escalated from there, but Marshal Davis stepped between them with the authority of federal law behind him. "Gentlemen," he said firmly, "I think it's time we got to the bottom of this situation. Mr. Blackwood, you're under arrest for possession of forged federal documents. Mr. Lewis, you and your men are going to accompany me back to town for questioning about your involvement in this scheme." "This is outrageous," Blackwood protested. "I'm an attorney. I have rights." "You have the right to remain silent," Marshal Davis said dryly. "I suggest you exercise it." As the marshal and his deputies began the process of arresting Blackwood and questioning Lewis's men, Judge Morrison approached Matthew and Citlali with a satisfied expression. "Well," he said cheerfully, "that was certainly educational. Mrs. Sandival, I hope this puts your mind at ease about your legal status. Your marriage is perfectly valid under territorial law, and these gentlemen have no legal claim on you whatsoever." Citlali sagged against Matthew's side, the tension finally draining from her frame. "It's really over." "Not entirely," Marshal Davis interjected, overhearing her question. "We'll need your testimony about Morrison's operation, Mrs. Sandival. What you saw, what you experienced, what you know about their methods of acquiring and controlling workers." Matthew felt Citlali tense again. "Does she have to? Testifying could put her in danger." "She can choose," Marshal Davis assured them. "But I'll be honest, your wife's testimony could be the key to shutting down Morrison's entire network. There are dozens of other women still trapped in his system. Your escape and this confrontation have given us the opening we've been waiting for to investigate the whole operation." Citlali was quiet for a long moment, staring at Lewis as he was led away in shackles. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and determined. "I'll testify," she said. "Those other women, they deserve the same chance at freedom that Matthew gave me." The words hit Matthew like a punch to the chest. Over the past 3 weeks, he'd watched his wife slowly reclaim pieces of herself, her strength, her dignity, her sense of worth. But this was something more. This was Citlali choosing to use her painful experiences as a weapon against the system that had tried to destroy her. "Are you sure?" he asked gently. "It won't be easy reliving all of that in front of strangers." "I'm sure," Citlali replied firmly. "For the first time since they took me from my family, I have the power to fight back. I won't waste that chance." As the last of Lewis's men rode away under guard, the yard gradually emptied until only Matthew Sandival and a handful of their allies remained. Doc Patterson approached them with the satisfied expression of a man who'd just seen justice served. "Well," he said, "that was considerably more excitement than I usually get on my morning rounds. Mrs. Sandival, how are you holding up?" "Better than I expected," Sandival admitted. "For months, I've been afraid of those men, afraid they would find me and drag me back. But seeing them arrested, seeing their lies exposed, it feels like waking up from a nightmare." "Good," Doc Patterson said warmly, "because you've got a lot of living to catch up on." Over the following weeks, as federal investigators descended on Morrison's operation and began the complex process of building a case, Matthew and Sandival settled into the rhythm of married life. It was different from what either of them had expected. Not the passionate romance of dime novels, but something steadier and perhaps more valuable. They were partners in the truest sense, two people who had chosen to build a life together based on mutual respect and shared purpose. Sandival threw herself into preparing for her testimony with the same determination she'd once shown in learning to ride horses or tend wounded animals. She spent hours with federal investigators carefully documenting every detail of Morrison's operation, providing names and dates and descriptions that helped authorities track down other victims and build an airtight case. The process was painful. Matthew could see the toll it took on her to relive those experiences, to speak aloud the things that had been done to her and others. But he also saw something else, a sense of purpose that gave her strength, a knowledge that her suffering would serve a greater good. "Sometimes," she told him one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, "I think about what my grandmother would say if she could see me now. A married Apache woman testifying in federal court against white men who trafficked in human beings." "What do you think she would say?" Matthew asked. Sandival smiled, the expression transforming her face in ways that still took his breath away. "I think she would say that the spirits work in mysterious ways, and that every person has a role to play in the great circle of justice." "Wise woman, your grandmother." "She was," Sandival agreed. "She used to tell me that the strongest warriors weren't always the ones with the fastest horses or the sharpest arrows. Sometimes the strongest warriors were the ones who survived the darkest battles and came back to help others find their way to the light." Matthew reached over and took her hand, marveling at how natural the gesture had become. 3 months ago, she would have flinched away from any physical contact. Now, she intertwined their fingers with easy familiarity, drawing comfort from his touch instead of fearing it. "I'm proud of you," he said simply, "for everything you've done, everything you've become." "I couldn't have done it alone," Sandival replied. "That night in the barn when you said you'd wait until I was ready, I didn't believe anyone could be that patient, but you were. You gave me time to remember who I was before they tried to take that away from me." "And who are you?" Matthew asked gently. Sandival considered the question seriously, as she did most things. "I'm Sandival Sandival," she said finally. "Wife, survivor, witness for justice. A woman who rides horses and tends gardens and helps her husband run a ranch. A woman who was broken but refused to stay that way." The trial, when it finally came, was everything they'd expected, and more. Morrison himself was a small, thin man with cold eyes who showed no remorse for the lives he'd destroyed in pursuit of profit. His lawyers tried every trick in the book to discredit Sandival's testimony, painting her as a vengeful runaway with delusions of persecution. But Sandival stood firm in the witness box, answering every question with quiet dignity and unshakable honesty. She spoke about the other women, the children, the systematic brutality that had been hidden behind legal documents and government connections. Her words painted a picture of organized criminality that shocked even hardened federal prosecutors. When the verdict came down guilty on all counts, with sentences that would put Morrison and his associates away for the rest of their lives. Citlali wept openly for the first time since that storm-lashed night when Matthew had found her in his barn. But these were different tears, cleaner somehow, carrying away the last of the poison that had been festering in her soul for so long. "It's over," she whispered to Matthew as they left the courthouse. "Really, truly over." "No," Matthew corrected gently. "It's beginning. Everything that happened before was just the prologue. This is where our real story starts." They rode home through country that seemed somehow brighter, as if the sun itself was celebrating the triumph of justice over cruelty. As they crested the familiar hill that looked down on their ranch, Citlali reined in her horse, a gentle mare that Matthew had bought specifically for her, and gazed at the spread of buildings and pastures that had become their shared domain. "I've been thinking," she said quietly. "About what? About children." Citlali said, her cheeks flushing pink. "Not right away, maybe not for a while yet, but someday. Children who would grow up knowing they were wanted, loved, protected. Children who would never have to run through the night looking for someone to save them." Matthew felt his throat tighten with emotion. Over the months of their marriage, they had grown closer in ways both profound and simple, but the question of physical intimacy had remained unspoken between them. He had been content to wait to let her set the pace to build trust, one careful day at a time. "Someday," he agreed softly, "when you're ready." Citlali turned to look at him, and in her dark eyes he saw not the terrified girl who had cowered in his barn, but a woman who had reclaimed her power, her voice, her right to choose her own destiny. "I think," she said slowly, "that someday might be sooner than either of us expected." As they rode down toward their home, Matthew reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. He had thought himself done with hope, finished with love, resigned to spending his remaining years in solitary grief. Instead, he had been given something he'd never expected, a second chance at happiness, built not on passion, but on something deeper and perhaps more lasting. Behind them, the mountains stood eternal against the darkening sky, witnesses to the small miracle that had unfolded in their shadow. A lonely rancher and a broken Apache girl had found each other in the midst of a storm and chosen to build something beautiful from the ruins of their separate tragedies. In the years that followed, travelers passing through would hear the story of Matthew Sandival, the Apache woman who had faced down her tormentors in federal court and helped bring down one of the territory's most notorious criminal operations. They would speak of her husband, the rancher, who had proven that sometimes the greatest act of love was simply waiting until someone was ready to be loved. But for Matthew and Citlali themselves, the story was simpler and more profound. They had learned that healing was possible, that trust could be rebuilt, that two people could create a family based not on blood or tradition, but on the conscious choice to stand together against whatever storms might come. As the last light faded from the western sky and the first stars began to appear, they reached their home, a place where fear had been transformed into safety, where solitude had given way to companionship, where two wounded souls had discovered that sometimes the most beautiful things in life grew not from perfection, but from the courage to tend carefully to what was broken until it became whole again. The end of their story was really just the beginning, a foundation built strong enough to support whatever future they chose to build together. And in a world that often seemed determined to test the limits of human endurance, that was perhaps the most remarkable miracle of all, the simple, extraordinary fact that love, patience, and determination could still triumph over cruelty, that hope could still find a way to bloom even in the darkest soil. The autumn of their third year together brought unexpected visitors to the Sandival ranch. Matthew was mending fence in the south pasture when he spotted the dust cloud on the horizon, but this time his heart didn't leap with fear. The approaching riders moved with the careful pace of travelers, not the aggressive urgency of hunters, and as they drew closer he could see they were leading pack animals, heavy with supplies. There were 5 of them, 3 women, a teenage boy, and an elderly man, all bearing the unmistakable features and dress of Apache people. They rode with the cautious dignity of those who had learned to expect hostility from the white world, but refused to let that expectation diminish their inherent pride. Matthew set down his tools and walked toward the ranch house, calling for Citlali as he went. She emerged from the garden where she'd been harvesting the last of the season's vegetables, her hands still dusty from the earth. Her hair caught back in a practical braid that had become her preferred style for working. When she saw the approaching riders, she went very still, her hand rising unconsciously to shade her eyes as she studied them. "Apache," she said quietly, and Matthew heard a complex mix of emotions in that single word: longing, fear, hope, and something that might have been homesickness. "Family?" Matthew asked gently. Citlali shook her head slowly. "I don't think so, but—" She paused, watching the lead rider more carefully. "That woman, the one in front. There's something familiar about the way she sits her horse." As the group drew closer, the lead rider, a woman perhaps 40 years old, with silver threading through her black hair, raised her hand in the traditional Apache greeting. Citlali stepped forward, her own hand rising in response, and Matthew heard her breath catch as recognition dawned. "Ayanna," she whispered, then louder with joy and disbelief mingling in her voice. "Ayanna." The name meant nothing to Matthew until he remembered Ayanna had been Citlali's horse, her beloved mare that had been sold along with everything else when her village was destroyed. But this was clearly a person, not an animal, and as the woman dismounted and approached them, Matthew saw tears streaming down his wife's face. "Little Star," the woman said in accented English, using what Matthew realized must be the translation of Citlali's name. "We have been searching for you for 3 years. The reunion that followed was unlike anything Matthew had ever witnessed. Citlali, and the woman who he learned was named Ayanna, after the same eternal blossom that had given the horse its name, embraced with the fierce intensity of people who had thought they would never see each other again. They spoke rapidly in Apache, their words tumbling over each other as they tried to convey 3 years of separation loss and survival. Gradually, Matthew began to understand the connections. Ayanna was Citlali's cousin, the daughter of her father's brother, who had been away visiting relatives when the attack on their village occurred. She had spent the intervening years searching for survivors, following rumors and whispered stories across the territory, slowly gathering the scattered remnants of their people. The others with her represented similar stories, family members who had been separated during various raids and relocations, people who had escaped from work farms or reservation confinement, individuals who had chosen the dangerous path of freedom over the false security of government supervision. They were, Ayanna explained, part of a loose network of Apache people who had refused to accept that their way of life was finished. "We heard stories," Ayanna told Matthew, as Citlali showed the group where they could water their horses and make camp. Stories of an Apache woman who stood in a white man's court and spoke truth to power. Stories of a rancher who married her to protect her from the slave traders. We did not know if such stories could be true. "They're true," Matthew said simply, "though I think Citlali would tell you that she protected herself. I just gave her a safe place to remember who she was." Ayanna studied him with the sharp attention of someone accustomed to reading character in a glance. "You love her?" It wasn't a question, but Matthew answered anyway. "Yes, not the way I loved my first wife, but yes, I love her courage, her strength, her refusal to let what happened to her define who she became. I love the way she hums Apache songs while she works, and the way she talks to the horses, and the way she still marvels at simple kindnesses as if they were miracles. And she loves you." Matthew glanced toward where Citlali was kneeling beside the teenage boy, examining what appeared to be an infected cut on his arm with the gentle competence she'd developed from helping Doc Patterson with various medical emergencies around the territory. "She loves the safety I can give her, he said honestly. The protection, the stability. Whether that will ever become something deeper, I don't know. I'm content to wait and see. 3 years is a long time to wait, Ayanna observed. Some things are worth waiting for, Matthew replied. That evening, as the Apache travelers made camp near the house, Matthew found himself witness to something he'd never expected to see: Citlali reconnecting with her heritage in ways that their isolated life had made impossible. She sat in the circle around the small campfire, listening to stories told in her native language, participating in conversations that ranged from practical matters of survival to complex discussions of Apache law and tradition. Matthew remained at the edge of the gathering, understanding little of what was said, but feeling the importance of what was happening. This was Citlali reclaiming a part of herself that had been dormant, not dead, during their years together. She was remembering what it meant to be Apache, not just in heritage but in living practice. The teenage boy, whose name was Naelnish, had been born in captivity and raised by white families who had tried to civilize him. His Apache was halting, his knowledge of traditional ways limited, but his hunger to learn was evident in every question he asked. Matthew watched Citlali take on the role of teacher, sharing songs and stories that her grandmother had taught her, demonstrating traditional methods of plant preparation and food preservation. "She is different than we expected," Ayanna said quietly, settling beside Matthew as the evening wore on. "Stronger, more settled." "Marriage has been good for her," Matthew agreed, "but so has having a purpose. The trial, helping other victims, building something new instead of just surviving. It's given her a sense of worth that goes beyond what I could provide." "And what has she given you?" Matthew considered the question seriously. "A reason to care about the future again. Before Citlali, I was just going through the motions of living. She reminded me that life is meant to be more than just endurance." Ayanna nodded thoughtfully. "In our tradition, there are different kinds of marriages. Some are arranged for practical reasons, alliance between families, economic advantage, protection. Others grow from attraction, passion, the pull of one heart toward another. But the strongest marriages, the ones that last beyond the passion and survive when practical advantages disappear, are built on something deeper." "What's that?" "Recognition," Ayanna said simply. "The recognition that two people see in each other something that makes them more than they could be alone. Not completion. We are not incomplete without a partner, but enhancement. Like harmony in singing, where two voices create something more beautiful than either could produce alone." Matthew watched his wife across the firelight, saw her animated face as she shared some story that made the others laugh, saw the way her hands moved gracefully as she spoke. "I think I understand what you mean. The question," Ayanna continued, "is what happens now? Citlali has found her family again, her people. Will she want to stay with them, to live as Apache among Apache?" The possibility hit Matthew like a physical blow, though he tried not to let it show on his face. In 3 years of marriage, he had never seriously considered that Citlali might choose to leave. She had seemed so settled, so content with their life together, that he had assumed their future was fixed. "If that's what she wants," he said finally, "then that's what she should do, even if it means losing her." Matthew was quiet for a long moment, watching the firelight dance across the faces of people who represented everything Citlali had lost and might now reclaim. "I married her to protect her freedom, not to trap her in a different kind of cage. If staying with me is what she chooses, it has to be a real choice, not just the best of limited options." The conversation was interrupted by Citlali herself, who approached them with 2 cups of coffee and a smile that seemed to light up the darkness. "You two look very serious," she observed, settling gracefully beside Matthew in a way that had become second nature over their years together. "Are you planning something I should know about?" "Just getting acquainted," Ayanna said diplomatically. "Your husband is not what we expected." "What did you expect?" Citlali asked with genuine curiosity. Someone who married an Apache woman for practical reasons, labor perhaps, or exotic appeal, or simply the cheapness of a wife with no family to negotiate with. Citlali's laugh was warm and genuine. Matthew is many things, but practical in the cold sense is not one of them. A practical man would have turned me over to Lewis and his people rather than risk his own safety and reputation. And why didn't he? Ayanna asked, though Matthew sensed she was testing rather than truly curious. Because Citlali said, reaching over to take Matthew's hand with casual affection, he believes that some things are more important than safety or reputation. He believes in doing what's right even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult. The conversation that followed lasted well into the night, ranging across topics that Matthew had never expected to discuss with anyone, let alone a group of Apache travelers around a campfire. They talked about the changing nature of the frontier, the complex relationships between different peoples trying to share the same land, the possibility of building bridges between cultures that had been taught to see each other as enemies. Nalnish, the young man who had been raised by white families, was particularly interested in Matthew's perspective. How do you balance it, he asked, living between two worlds, honoring both, without betraying either? I don't know that I'm the right person to ask, Matthew replied honestly. I'm still learning, still making mistakes, but I think it starts with respecting that both worlds have value, that neither one has all the answers. And when they conflict, when what's right in one world is wrong in the other. Matthew glanced at Citlali, remembering their wedding day and the choice to defy legal documents that claimed she was property. Then you have to decide which set of values you can live with and which ones you can't. Over the following days, as the Apache visitors rested and resupplied at the ranch, Matthew found himself learning more about his wife's heritage than he had in 3 years of marriage. Not because she had hidden it from him, but because she herself had been rediscovering what it meant to be Apache in a world that had tried to erase that identity entirely. He watched her teach Nalnish traditional ways of working with horses, methods that were different from white techniques, but equally effective. He listened to her sing songs that had been passed down through generations, melodies that seemed to capture something essential about the relationship between people and the land they lived on. He observed her preparing foods using traditional Apache methods, creating dishes that connected her to ancestral knowledge. But perhaps most importantly, he saw her grappling with questions that had no easy answers. What did it mean to preserve Apache culture while living in a white man's house? How could traditional values be maintained while adapting to new realities? Was it possible to be fully Apache while also being Mrs. Citlali Sandival? The conversation came to a head on the 5th night of their visit when Ayanna made the invitation that Matthew had been dreading. Come with us, she said to Citlali as they sat around the fire. We are building a new kind of community, one that honors the old ways while finding new ways to survive in this changed world. We need people like you, people who understand both worlds, who can help us navigate between them. Citlali was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames, as if they might provide answers to impossible questions. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful and careful. Where would we go? What kind of life would it be? North into Colorado, Ayanna explained. There are others like us there, Apache people, who have chosen freedom over the false security of reservations. We live quietly, carefully supporting each other while staying out of the government's sight. It's not an easy life, but it's ours. And Matthew, Citlali asked quietly, what place would there be for him in such a community? The question hung in the air, and Matthew felt his heart stop as he waited for the answer. Ayanna glanced at him, then back at her cousin. That would depend on many things. Whether he truly wants to be part of an Apache community, whether he's willing to learn our ways as you have learned his, whether he can accept being a minority in a world where Apache values take precedence. And if he can't, Citlali's voice was barely audible. Then you would have to choose, Ayanna said gently but firmly, between your husband and your people. The silence that followed was deafening. Matthew forced himself to remain still, to show no reaction that might influence Citlali's decision. This was her choice to make, and he would respect whatever conclusion she reached. I need time to think, Citlali said finally. This is not a decision to make quickly. Of course, Ayanna agreed. We will stay as long as you need. That night, Matthew lay awake in their bed for over the past year. Citlali had gradually transitioned from the guest room to sharing their space, though physical intimacy remained a careful negotiation of boundaries and comfort levels. Beside him, he could feel her own sleeplessness, the tension in her body as she wrestled with an impossible decision. Talk to me, he said quietly into the darkness. I don't know what to say, Citlali replied. For 3 years, I've been building a life with you, becoming Mrs. Sandival, learning to think of this ranch as home. But seeing Ayanna again, hearing our language, remembering what it felt like to be surrounded by people who understood my heritage without explanation, it's awakened something I thought was dead. What do you want to do? Matthew asked. I want both, Citlali said with painful honesty. I want to be with my people to help preserve our ways and raise children who know their Apache heritage. But I also want to stay here with you, to continue building the life we've created together. I want to honor my ancestors without abandoning my husband. Matthew reached for her hand in the darkness, finding it cold despite the warmth of the night. What if there was a way to have both? What do you mean? Matthew had been thinking about this possibility ever since Ayanna's invitation, turning over an idea that seemed impossible but might just be workable. What if we went with them? What if I learned to be part of an Apache community instead of asking you to live solely in a white one? Citlali turned toward him in the darkness, and though he couldn't see her face, he could feel her surprise. You would do that? Leave your ranch, your life here, everything you've built. I would do that for you, Matthew said simply. But more than that, I think I would do it for me. These past few days, listening to your people talk about their values, their connection to the land, their sense of community, there's something there that I've been missing in my own life. It wouldn't be easy, Citlali warned. You would be the outsider, the one who has to prove himself worthy of acceptance. There would be those who would never fully trust a white man, no matter how sincere his intentions. I've been an outsider before, Matthew reminded her. When I first came to this territory, when I was learning to be a rancher, when I was trying to figure out how to be a widower, being an outsider isn't comfortable, but it's not impossible either. They talked through the night, exploring possibilities and obstacles, fears and hopes. By dawn, they had reached a decision that felt right. Even if it wasn't easy, they would go with Ayanna and her people, not as refugees fleeing their old life, but as partners choosing to build something new together. The announcement, when they made it the next morning, was met with joy from some of the Apache visitors and concern from others. Ayanna embraced her cousin with tears in her eyes, while the elderly man of the group regarded Matthew with undisguised skepticism. You think you can just decide to become Apache? He asked bluntly. No, Matthew replied honestly. I think I can decide to try to become part of an Apache community. Whether I succeed will depend on many things, most of them beyond my control. And if you fail, if you find you cannot adapt, Matthew glanced at Citlali, then back at the old man, then I'll have to decide whether failing is worse than never trying at all. The preparations for leaving took several weeks. There was the ranch to consider, not just the land and buildings, but the animals that had become part of their family. Thunder would come with them, of course, along with Citlali's mare and a few other horses. The cattle would be sold to neighboring ranchers who had become friends over the years. Doc Patterson was among the hardest people to say goodbye to. The elderly physician had become something like a father figure to both of them, and his support during the dark days of Lewis's pursuit had been invaluable. "You're sure about this?" he asked as he helped them sort through medical supplies that might be useful in their new life. "It's a big step leaving everything familiar behind." 3 years ago, Sitlali said, "I thought my old life was over forever. Matthew helped me build a new one. Now we're choosing to build another new one together. It feels right." "And you, Matthew?" Doc Patterson asked. "No regrets about leaving all this behind?" Matthew looked around the house where he had lived with Sarah, where he had grieved her loss, where he had learned to love again in an entirely different way. "This place gave me what I needed when I needed it. But home isn't just a place, it's the people you choose to share your life with. Sitlali is my home now. Wherever she goes, that's where I belong." The journey north was unlike anything Matthew had ever experienced. Traveling with the Apache group meant moving differently across the landscape following older trails, reading signs in the land that white travelers missed living more lightly and leaving fewer traces. Matthew found himself learning skills he had never imagined needing, developing awareness of his environment that went far beyond the practical knowledge of a rancher. Sitlali seemed to blossom during the journey, her confidence growing as she moved back into a world where her heritage was an asset rather than a liability. She served as translator not just of language but of culture, helping Matthew understand the subtle social dynamics of the group while helping the others appreciate his genuine desire to learn and contribute. The community they eventually reached was nothing like Matthew had imagined. Rather than a traditional Apache village, it was something entirely new, a collection of small homesteads scattered across a hidden valley, each family maintaining their own space while participating in a larger network of mutual support and shared resources. There were perhaps 50 people in total, representing not just Apache, but also Navajo Pueblo and even a few Mexicans and whites who had for various reasons chosen to live outside the dominant Anglo society. What united them was not ethnicity, but a shared commitment to values that prioritized community welfare over individual accumulation, environmental stewardship over resource exploitation, and cultural preservation over assimilation. Matthew and Sitlali were given a small plot of land near a stream where they began the process of building yet another new life. It was hard work, both physical and emotional, but it was also deeply satisfying in ways that Matthew was still learning to understand. The real test came during their first winter when the isolation and challenges of their new life stripped away all pretense and revealed the true character of their relationship. They had to depend on each other completely, not just as husband and wife, but as partners in survival. They learned to heat their small cabin efficiently, to preserve food using traditional methods to navigate the complex social dynamics of a community where consensus building was more important than individual authority. It was during this winter that their marriage finally became fully consummated, not through passion or obligation, but through a deep recognition of their complete commitment to each other and to the life they were building together. When Sitlali told him she was pregnant the following spring, Matthew felt a joy that was different from anything he had experienced before, not the recapture of a lost happiness, but the discovery of something entirely new. Their son was born in late autumn, delivered by the skilled hands of Apache midwives, and welcomed into a community that would help raise him with knowledge of both his heritages. They named him Samuel in honor of Matthew's father, with the Apache name Bidziel, meaning he is strong, to honor Sitlali's lineage. As Matthew held his son for the first time, looking into eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of both worlds, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. He had begun as a lonely rancher grieving a lost love, had become the protector of a terrified refugee, had evolved into the husband of a remarkable woman, and now found himself a father in a community that valued children as the bearers of cultural continuity. The boy would grow up bilingual, bicultural, comfortable in both the Apache and Anglo worlds, but not entirely belonging to either. He would face challenges that Matthew could not imagine, would have to navigate questions of identity and belonging that had no simple answers. But he would also have advantages that neither of his parents had possessed: the knowledge that it was possible to build bridges between worlds, that strength came not from purity, but from the courage to embrace complexity. Years later, when travelers brought news from the outside world, Matthew and Sitlali would learn that their story had become something of a legend in the territory. The tale of the Apache woman who had testified against the slave traders and the rancher who had given up everything to follow her into a new way of life had been told and retold, growing in the telling until it bore only passing resemblance to their actual experience. But the legend didn't matter to them. What mattered was the quiet reality of their daily life, the satisfaction of work done well, the pleasure of watching their children grow, and learn the deep contentment that came from living according to their values rather than merely surviving. On quiet evenings, when the day's work was done and the children were asleep, Matthew and Sitlali would sometimes sit together and remember that storm-lashed night when a terrified girl had sought shelter in a lonely man's barn. They would marvel at how much had changed, how far they had traveled, not just in miles, but in understanding of what it meant to build a life worth living. "Do you ever regret it?" Sitlali asked one such evening. "Giving up your ranch, your old life, everything you had worked for?" Matthew considered the question seriously, as he always did when she asked it. Around them, their adopted community hummed with the quiet sounds of people preparing for another day, children being put to bed, adults finishing evening chores, the soft murmur of conversations in multiple languages. "I regret nothing," he said finally. "That old life served its purpose, but it was never meant to be permanent. This life, this place, these people, this feels like what I was meant to find. Even though it's harder, even though there are still people who don't fully accept you." "Especially because of those things," Matthew replied. "Easy acceptance isn't worth much, but earning your place in a community like this, being welcomed, not because of what you can take, but because of what you can give, that's something worth having." As the stars wheeled overhead in patterns that the Apache elders could read, like a book, Matthew reflected on the truth that had taken him years to understand. Love was not just about finding someone to share your existing life with, but about being willing to create an entirely new life together, one that honored both your past and your potential for growth. The story of Matthew and Sitlali had no neat ending, because the best stories never do. They simply continue day by day, year by year, with each choice and challenge adding another layer to the complex tapestry of a life shared between two people who had learned that sometimes the most profound journeys begin with the simple decision to extend shelter to someone caught in a storm.